There was a morning last November when I stood in my kitchen at 5:30, watching the coffee drip into the pot, and I thought I should have seen it coming. Not the cruelty. I had sensed that from the first handshake. What I hadn't seen coming was how completely it would undo him. My son, my quiet, careful, brilliant son, standing in the middle of a restaurant with 60 people watching, his face going pale the way it used to when he was 8 years old, and got called on in class before he was ready. I keep coming back to that moment. The way he set down his fork, the way he didn't say a word. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what my son always tells me. Mom, you always start in the middle. He's right, I do. So let me go back. My name is Gloria Hartwell. I'm 63 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house in Decatur, Georgia that I bought myself in 2009 when the market was low and everyone told me I was making a mistake. I have a vegetable garden in the backyard that produces more tomatoes than one person could ever reasonably eat, and a cat named Biscuit who has never once shown me affection but refuses to leave the room I'm sitting in. I retired early from a career I'll tell you more about later, because the career matters to this story, and I've learned that the order in which you reveal things changes what people understand. My son's name is Caleb. He's 31. He has my eyes and his father's stubborn streak, which I mean as a compliment to both of us. He works as a structural engineer, not the flashy kind that designs skyscrapers, but the kind that looks at a bridge or an overpass or an old building downtown and figures out whether it will hold. He's good at it. He's the kind of person who notices the thing everyone else walks past. He met Serena 2 years ago at a friend's birthday dinner. He called me afterward and said, I think I met someone, and the way he said it, careful, like he was testing the words out, I knew it was real. Caleb doesn't say things he doesn't mean. He never has. Serena is lovely. I want to make that clear, because this story is not about her. She's warm and funny and she laughs with her whole body. And the first time she came to my house, she noticed a photograph on my bookshelf and asked about it. And we sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours talking about a road trip I took alone through New Mexico in my 40s. She has that quality, the kind of attention that makes you feel like you're the most interesting person in the room. I loved her immediately, the way you love someone who loves your child well. Her parents were another matter. I met them once before the engagement dinner, a brief lunch at a restaurant in Buckhead, the expensive part of Atlanta. The kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices and everyone is performing something. Her father's name is Gerald Ashworth. He shook my hand the way certain men shake the hands of women over 60, briefly, loosely, like it's a courtesy rather than a greeting. Her mother Vivian smiled the entire time with her eyes perfectly still. Gerald talked about himself for 45 minutes, his development firm, his portfolio, a golf club in Sea Island he'd recently joined. He mentioned his square footage twice. I nodded and ate my salad and watched Caleb watch Serena, and I thought, the daughter didn't get this from her parents. She got here in spite of them. At the end of lunch, Gerald asked Caleb what he did. Caleb told him, structural engineering. Gerald said, good for you, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. I drove home on I-85 with the radio off, thinking about that tone. The engagement dinner was Gerald's idea. He insisted on planning it, insisted on the venue, a private room at a restaurant in Midtown that I recognize but won't name, the kind with leather banquets and a sommelier who materializes at your elbow every 12 minutes. Gerald had invited 30 of their closest friends and family. I brought my sister Paulette and my friend June, who has known Caleb since he was in diapers and cried at his Little League games even when he struck out. The room was already full when we arrived. Gerald and Vivian were holding court near the bar, and I watched Gerald's face when we walked in. The slight recalibration, the assessment, the decision made in 2 seconds that we did not quite fit. Dinner was pleasant on the surface. The food was excellent. Paulette, who grew up in a small town in Alabama and has never once pretended to be impressed by anything she wasn't actually impressed by, kept whispering to me that the crab cake was worth every bit of the drive. Caleb sat across from me next to Serena, and he was smiling. That real smile, not the polite one he learned at 14 and uses when he has to. Gerald stood up after the main course. I don't remember every word he said. I remember the feeling, the way the room tilted. He started with a toast. Normal enough. He talked about Serena, about how proud he was, about what a gift she was to everyone who knew her. People smiled and raised their glasses. And then he turned to Caleb, and something in his posture changed. A squaring, a settling. And he said, I want to be honest tonight, because I think honesty is a sign of respect. And I respect this room enough to say what some of us are thinking. He said that Serena had been raised with certain expectations, that their family had built something over generations, and that what they'd built deserved to be continued by someone who could, and he paused here, looking at Caleb, match that standard. He said Caleb was a nice young man. He said it the way you'd say a dog was well behaved. He said, but a city engineer who rents an apartment in East Atlanta is not what I had in mind for my daughter. He looked around the room as though he expected agreement. I'm not saying he's a bad person. I'm saying he's not enough. 60 people in a room. I looked at Caleb. He had set down his fork. His hands were flat on the table. He was looking at a spot just past Gerald's shoulder, the way he used to look when he was trying not to cry and refused to let himself. He was not going to make a scene. I knew that. I had raised him not to, which in this moment I was not sure was the right decision. Serena said Daddy in a voice so sharp it cut through the room. Her mother touched her arm. Caleb looked at me then, just for a second, and I saw it. The same look he gave me at 8 years old, at 14, at 22 when he called me from his first job and said his supervisor had told him to be more realistic about his ambitions. The look that said, this is how it is, this is the world. I smiled at him. A small smile. Not yet, it said. Wait. He nodded, barely, and picked his fork back up. We left shortly after. Gerald shook our hands at the door, my hand again, briefly, loosely. In the parking garage, Paulette said 3 words under her breath that I will not repeat here but that were entirely accurate. June held my arm and said nothing, which was the right thing. Caleb hugged me before he got in his car. He's taller than me by a foot, and he bent down to do it, and I held on for a moment longer than usual, and I felt him take a breath, the kind of breath you take when you're putting something away. I'm fine, Mom, he said. I know you are, I said. I know. I drove home and sat in my kitchen with the lights off for a long time. I need to tell you something about my career now, because it matters. I spent 31 years in commercial real estate finance, not selling properties, financing them. I worked at a regional bank in Atlanta for the first 12 years, then went independent, and for the last 16 years before I retired, I ran my own firm, Hartwell Capital Partners. We specialized in financing mid to large commercial developments throughout the Southeast, mixed-use projects, urban redevelopment, the kind of deals that require patient money and people who understand how to structure risk. I was not famous. I was not on magazine covers. I was not the kind of person who talked about herself at lunch in Buckhead. But in 31 years, I had financed or co-financed over $2 billion in commercial real estate across Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, and the Carolinas. I knew every major developer in the region. Most of them at some point had needed something from me. I retired 2 years ago at 61. Not because I had to, because I wanted to grow tomatoes and read books and be available when my son called, which turned out to be a very good decision. I had not mentioned any of this to Gerald Ashworth because he had not asked, and I don't offer information to people who have decided they already know what I am. The Monday after the engagement dinner, I got a call from a friend at my old firm. His name is Marcus. He worked with me for 15 years and now runs the day-to-day operations. And he was calling because he'd gotten an inquiry he thought I should know about. Gerald Ashworth's development company was looking for bridge financing on a mixed-use project in Alpharetta. $47 million. Their primary lender had tightened their terms after a rate adjustment, and they needed a capital partner to cover a gap or the deal fell apart. Marcus had gotten the referral through a mutual contact. Gerald's team didn't know whose firm they were calling. I listened to Marcus describe the project. It was a decent project. The numbers weren't bad. "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked. I thought about Caleb's face. The fork set down, the hands flat on the table, the look. "Set up a meeting," I said. "Here, my office." There was a pause. "You're coming in?" "Yes," I said. "I'll be there Tuesday. I want to be clear about something. I did not do what I did for revenge, exactly. Revenge implies you want the other person to suffer, and I am 63 years old, and I have been through enough to know that other people's suffering is not satisfying the way you think it will be. It's empty. It echoes. What I wanted was simpler than that. I wanted Gerald Ashworth to understand what he had not bothered to find out. I wanted the education to cost him something, and I wanted, if I'm being truthful, to stand in a room with him and feel the air change. So I went to my office on Tuesday morning. I wore the grey suit I used to wear when I closed the deals that mattered, charcoal, well cut, the kind of thing that reads as authority without announcing itself. I got there early, had coffee with Marcus, looked over the file, and then I sat at the head of the conference table and I waited. Gerald walked in at 10 o'clock with two members of his team, a young man with a laptop bag and a woman who was clearly his CFO, someone competent and uncomfortable in this situation. They were looking at their phones as they came through the door, and then Gerald looked up and he stopped. I watched him find my face. I watched him try to place me because in context I was wrong. I was supposed to be a lender he'd never met, and instead I was a woman he'd dismissed across a restaurant table 4 days earlier. I watched him run the calculation. I let him get all the way through it before I said anything. Then I said, "Good morning, Gerald. Please sit down." His CFO looked at him. He didn't look at her. "We've met," he said. His voice was careful. "We have," I said, briefly. "I'm Gloria Hartwell. I'm the founding partner of this firm, and I understand your team is looking for a capital partner on the Alpharetta project." He sat down. I'll give him that. He sat down and he composed himself, and he put his hands on the table, and I noticed his hands were steady. He was a man who had navigated things before. We went through the project. His CFO walked us through the numbers, which were solid, and I asked the questions I always ask, and Marcus took notes, and for 40 minutes it was a normal meeting. Almost, because Gerald knew. The entire time he knew. I could see it in the way he was calculating. Not the deal, not anymore, but the position he was in, and what it meant, and what came next. At the end of the meeting, I closed the folder. I said, "The project is financeable. The terms I'd offer are 30-day close, standard covenanters, and I'd want a personal guarantee from the principals given the rate environment." He nodded. Before we talked terms further, I said, "I want to ask you something." I leaned back in my chair. "How is Serena?" The room was very quiet. "She's well," he said after a moment. "Good," I said. "She's a remarkable young woman. My son thinks so too." I paused. "Your future son-in-law, the city engineer." His CFO was studying the table. "I don't," Gerald started. "You don't have to say anything," I said. I meant it. I'm not here to negotiate anything other than what's in this folder. The deal is the deal. I separate business from personal, always have. I let that land for a second. But I did want you to know who you were sitting across from, since we never got a proper introduction. Gerald Ashworth looked at me for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. He understood completely the full dimension of what had happened, not just in this room, but in that restaurant, and what it had cost him in ways he hadn't known to account for. He said, "I owe your son an apology. I hadn't expected that. I want to be honest about that. I hadn't expected it, and it moved me more than I wanted it to." "Yes," I said, "you do." He did apologize. He called Caleb that evening. I don't know what he said. Caleb only told me it was a real apology, the kind that doesn't ask for anything back. Serena told me later that her father had come home from a meeting that afternoon and been very quiet all night. The financing didn't go through. Not because I killed it, but because Gerald's team found the different solution 2 weeks later, which was fine. I would have done the deal if we'd agreed on terms. I told Marcus to treat it like any other inquiry, which he did. What happened after that is the part that matters more than any of this. Caleb and Serena got married the following April in a small ceremony in the North Georgia mountains. 22 people, a meadow, a minister who had known Serena since she was a girl. Gerald walked his daughter down the aisle and shook Caleb's hand at the altar, a real handshake this time, the kind that means something. I sat in the front row next to Paulette. June was there. The mountains were still brown at the edges, but there was green coming up through it, the way green does in early spring in Georgia, insistent and quiet at the same time. When the minister asked if anyone objected, Paulette leaned over and whispered, "Nobody better," and I had to press my lips together to keep from laughing out loud. Caleb cried when he saw Serena. Not a lot, just at the edges. The way quiet people cry when the thing they've been careful about finally arrives. I didn't cry until later, in the car, with the radio off. The good kind. I've thought a lot about what I would say if someone asked me what the lesson is. There's a version of the story where the lesson is about karma, or comeuppance, or things working out the way they should. I don't fully believe in any of those, if I'm being honest. The world doesn't guarantee that the right people end up in the right rooms, but sometimes they do. Gerald Ashworth didn't know what I was because he didn't ask. He looked at me and made a decision in 2 seconds, the same way he looked at Caleb and made a decision in 2 seconds, and he was wrong both times. That's the thing about deciding you already know. You stop looking. And what you stop looking at has a way of walking in through your office door on a Tuesday morning. Caleb called me a few weeks after the wedding. He'd gotten a promotion, senior project lead on a transit infrastructure overhaul the city was planning, the kind of project that shapes how a place moves for decades. He was talking fast, excited in the way he only gets when the work is real, and I sat in my kitchen with the tomatoes coming up outside and biscuits sitting in the doorway pretending not to watch me, and I listened to my son, and I thought, he was always enough. He was always exactly enough. Some people never figure out what they're sitting across from. That's not your problem to solve. Know your worth and let the room catch up. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it actually costs a person to look down on someone else. Not the social cost, not the business cost, I mean the internal cost. The narrowing that happens inside you when you decide in 2 seconds flat that you already know what another person is worth. Gerald Ashworth paid that cost. Not because the universe stepped in to balance some ledger. I don't think it works that way, not neatly, not on a schedule. He paid it because the habit of dismissing people without looking closely at them is a habit that compounds. You do it once, you do it 100 times, and eventually you walk into a room completely unprepared for what's sitting across the table. That's not fate, that's just the arithmetic of character. What I keep coming back to is this: Gerald wasn't a foolish man. In business, he was careful, thorough, experienced. But he had a blind spot the size of a highway, and that blind spot was the assumption that he could read a person's value from the surface, from their job title, their zip code, the neighborhood their apartment was in. He looked at Caleb and saw a number that didn't meet his threshold. He looked at me and saw a woman in her 60s who wasn't worth asking about. And in both cases, he was wrong in ways that mattered. That's the thing about intelligence. Real intelligence, the kind that actually serves you through a life. It's not about what you know, it's about staying curious about what you don't know yet. It's about walking into a room and understanding that the person across from you might contain something you haven't accounted for. Gerald was educated, accomplished, successful by every conventional measure. But he had stopped being curious, and that's a kind of erosion that doesn't announce itself. It just quietly takes away your ability to see clearly. Caleb has always been curious. That's the thing about him I'm most proud of, more than any degree or any promotion or any project with his name on it. He's the kind of person who asks the follow-up question, who sits with a problem until he understands it from the inside out. He doesn't need the validation of a room. He just needs the work to be real, and it usually is. I raised him to understand that your integrity is the one asset no one can finance away from you. No one can acquire in a deal. No one can take in a bad quarter. You build it slowly, the way anything worth having is built, through consistency, through showing up, through doing the thing right, even when doing it wrong would be easier and no one would notice. That's the discipline I watched him apply at 31 years old in the middle of that restaurant, when he set down his fork and kept his hands still and didn't give Gerald Ashworth the satisfaction of a reaction. That stillness was not weakness. It was 31 years of character. What I hope, if there's anything useful in this story for anyone, is just this. Don't let anyone's assessment of you become the ceiling you build your life under. The people who underestimate you are not oracles. They're just people with incomplete information who stopped asking questions. You are not required to correct them. You are only required to keep going, keep building, keep becoming, and let the room catch up when it does. It usually does.